Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Ben Francis and tonight I'm joined by Dundee councillor Siobhan Tolland. Hi Siobhan, how are you doing today?
Hi, yeah, not too bad. It's Toland, sorry, just a wee thing about my name.
Toland, oh sorry. No, I often
No.
get named a bit wrong, it's fine. Okay, Toland, yeah. So, on to our first story, the Ukraine update on day 800 of the war. Weapons supplied by the UK to Ukraine can be used to strike inside Russia, David Cameron has said, as the UK Foreign Secretary promised 3 billion a year, quote, for as long as it is necessary to help Kiev. The UK the UK also committed to doubling its domestic munitions production by investing a further 10 billion over the next 10 years. In an interview with The Economist, Emmanuel Macron has said the question of sending Western troops to Ukraine would, quote, legitimately arise if Russia broke through Ukrainian front lines and Kiev made such a request. At least 8 children were injured in the town of Der Hanchi in Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv region on Thursday when Russian guided bombs struck a site close to a sports complex where they had been training. Local officials said an elderly man was also wounded. Russia said on Thursday it had captured the village of Berdichi, which lies about 12 kilometers northwest of Avdiivka, a week after Ukrainian forces pulled out. Over the weekend, Ukraine's commander-in-chief Oleksandr Siersky said troops had retreated from Berdichi and two other nearby villages to protect, quote, the lives and health of defenders. Russian energy company Gazprom said on Thursday it suffered a record annual loss in 2023 as the European market was practically shut to its gas exports due to war sanctions. The state-owned firm suffered a net loss of 692 billion rubles, about 5.5 billion pounds, in 2023, compared with a net profit of 1.23 trillion rubles in 2022. The governors of three Russian regions reported that energy facilities were damaged by Ukrainian drone strikes. The Kremlin has rejected allegations made by the US that Russian forces used chemical weapon chloropicrin against Ukrainians. The Chinese government said it would take, quote, necessary measures in response to what it called, quote, the illegal and unilateral sanctions against, quote, normal trading relations. NATO has condemned an intensifying campaign of Russian malign activities, quote unquote, on member states' territories, including disinformation, sabotage, violence, and cyber interference. Authorities in the Czech Republic, Estonia, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and the UK have recently investigated and charged people in connection with hostile state activity. So, Siobhan, just to pick up on Macron's comments, do you think it was responsible for him to suggest sending Western troops into Ukraine if Russia does make a breakthrough?
It's a fine line, isn't it? It's good because we're kind of stuck in this fine line between doing nothing and then doing something that might escalate. So, honestly, I don't envy Macron in this decision, but there is an element of this invasion has gone on and on and on, and we seem to be letting it drag out in the West. We're offering kind of like a bit of kind of piecemeal support. It just feels that putting troops in would escalate it to a point that we wouldn't know the consequences of how what would happen should we do that. So there's an element there if we really have to kind of risk assess that decision because it could make matters 100 times worse. But I kind of, I feel for that decision because the instinct is to try and do something because, we all feel quite helpless in terms of the situation in Ukraine as well as in Gaza as well. So there's elements there if we have to really need to kind of get a grip, but it just feels like it's maybe taken it a step that we might not, the consequences might be too much.
Yeah, do you think maybe he's possibly not taking the threat of a potential global war seriously enough when he makes a comment like that?
I think there is an element of that, isn't it? There's quite a kind
Mm.
of maybe an insular look to it, but at the same time, Russia should be taken into account in some way in terms of what they've done, and there seems to be nothing we have done recently has prevented that continuing invasion. Yes, so it is a fine line, but yes, I think that there's maybe just that there needs to be a bit more thought taken in terms of how we react and how we respond. We have to do something, but it has to be something that means peace rather than an escalation of war, as you said.
Yeah, no, definitely agree with that. So, looking at the time, we'll move on to the Israel Gaza latest. At least 34,622 Palestinians have been killed and 77,867 injured in Gaza since 7th of October, the Gaza Health Ministry has said in a statement today. Daror Or, 49, an Israeli man held hostage in Gaza since the 7th of October attacks, has been confirmed dead. Jens Larky, the spokesperson for the UN Humanitarian Office in Geneva, said today that an Israeli incursion in Rafah could result in slaughter. He said, quote, it could be a slaughter of civilians and an incredible blow to the humanitarian operation in the entire strip because it is run primarily out of Rafah. A World Health Organization (WHO) official said today that the agency had a contingency plan prepared in case of an Israeli incursion into Gaza's Rafah, but said it would not be sufficient to prevent a substantial rise in the death toll. The availability of food in the Gaza Strip has slightly, or very slightly, improved, though the risk of famine remains. Rick Peppercorn, the WHO representative in the Palestinian territories, told a press briefing in Geneva via video link from Jerusalem. 7 people were killed in an overnight airstrike on a home in northern Rafah, according to Al Jazeera's Tariq Abu Azoum, who was reporting from the southern Gaza district. Turkey's trade halt with Israel will continue until a permanent ceasefire in Gaza is secured, as well as unhindered humanitarian aid flow to the region, Turkish Trade Minister Omar Bolat said today. Since October 2023, more than 100 Palestinian reporters have been killed in Gaza, including at least 22 in the course of their work, according to Reporters Without Borders, (RSF), which published its annual World Press Freedom Index today to mark World Press Freedom Day 2024. A senior Palestinian doctor died in an Israeli prison after more than 4 months of detention, 2 Palestinian prisoner associations said on Thursday, blaming Israel for his death. The associations said in a joint statement that Adnan al-Bursh, head of orthopedics at Al-Shifa Hospital, Gaza's largest medical facility, had been detained by Israeli forces while temporarily working at Al-Awad Hospital in northern Gaza. They called his death an, quote, assassination, and said his body remained in Israeli custody. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, said in comments on X that she was alarmed by the deaths of Burch in Israeli detention. On Thursday, the Israeli authorities released 64 Palestinians that they had detained during the military offensive in Gaza via the Israeli-controlled Kerem Shalom crossing. The Palestinian Borders and Crossings Agency has said. The Australian government will decide next week on whether to support admitting Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. Police in Paris entered France's prestigious Sciences Po University on Friday and removed student activists who had occupied its buildings in protests against Israel's conduct in its war in the Gaza Strip. In Australia, hundreds of pro-Palestine protesters met a counter-protest supporting Israel at the University of Sydney today. So, Siobhan, to touch on the news with Turkey, like more specifically, do you think more nations could start to embargo or sanction Israel following Turkey's decision? Could it be the start of a trend?
Yes, I think we should have done that a long time ago. We should have stopped all arms sales to Israel as well, because if we're not, then we're facilitating a genocide. And I think we need to be really clear about that. The 7 people that were killed today included 4 children. There's 15,000 children just under being killed, and there are children dying of starvation and malnutrition and thirst every single day in Gaza. The Human Rights Watch and other organisations talk about starvation as being used as a weapon of war against the Palestinian people in Gaza. So it comes back to that situation in terms of Macron as well. We have to do something. We have to do something. We are sitting watching a genocide. So yes, no, absolutely. I am not a fan of Erdogan in Turkey. I'm going to be absolutely honest, but that concept of embargoing and removing our arms sales from Israel is the only way that we could stop them. Just as an aside, you mentioned UNESCO World Press Freedom Day today. The prize this year was given to all Palestinian journalists in Gaza for their effort there. But yes, I think we absolutely have to do something. The problem we have is that the Western countries, like the US especially, will not budge. And until the US begins to budge, the Israel government, the far right Israel government, think they can do exactly what they want. So they have to be brought to account. Yeah. So we need to start thinking about that. You talk about there's lots of kind of demonstrations. It's kind of
Yeah.
flaring up in the US as well as Australia and Paris and France and so forth as well. So there is a real tension across the globe in terms of social justice here. This is a human rights battle like no other. Like no other, where the notion of human rights is the envelope there has been pushed to its absolute brink. Because if we don't call this to account, if we don't call it a genocide, if we don't stop it, then where does that leave where does that leave the globe? Where does that leave the world in terms of what human rights might be? So yes, it's important that we begin to act, and we should have acted. We should have acted months ago.
Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah. So, on to our main story of the night, English local election results. Results have come in today for English local elections, including some mayoral elections and the Blackpool South parliamentary by-election. The results so far have been positive for the Labour Party, which have gained over 100 councillors and won two, no, I think it's now three out of the four mayoral races, because one just got called like 20 minutes ago. The party also won the Blackpool South by-election from the Conservative with a 20% jump in vote share. Despite the bad results for the Conservative Party, which lost over 200 councillors, the party has managed to hold on to Tees Valley, with Mayor Ben Houchin winning re-election for the Conservatives. As well as Labour, smaller parties and independents have also done quite well in the local elections. In particular, Reform UK, which came neck to neck with a Conservative candidate in Blackpool South, as well as in the mayoral race in the North East. The Liberal Democrats and Green Party have both also done well in the council elections, with both parties increasing their vote share and picking up new councillors. Additionally, Labour has faced challenges in some areas, like Manchester and the North East, by independent candidates running to the party's left, with independent candidates that campaigned against the war on Gaza taking some council seats from the Labour Party in Greater Manchester. So, Siobhan, I've got a few questions, but just firstly on Reform UK, I guess, do you think these elections sort of show that they might be more of a substantial player in the next general election, given how close they've got to the Conservatives? And,
I mean, the thing with the thing with the council elections is they're kind of smaller and they're local, and the electoral system is slightly different. But Westminster's a first past the post system, so it's quite hard for the smaller parties to kind of break through in that sense. So I think Reform's sitting on about 14-15%,
yeah,
something like that. That seems quite a lot, but you would need to that would be, it's still difficult to break through in terms of the first past the post system. So they're certainly making gains in the consciousness of people in England, and certainly kind of making gains in the consciousness of Conservatives. That shift to the right is even more terrifying, I have to absolutely admit. But whether they make gains in a general election is yet to be seen. They may pick up a seat or two, but
yeah.
it's very unlikely that they're going to make gains across the board, given the way that the system works in the Westminster election.
Yeah, well, so do you think it's more likely they might just end up like really hurting the Conservative Party by taking like a lot of vote share?
Yes, I think that that's probably where the damage is going to be done, isn't it? And they're kind of feeling that a little bit at the moment, in terms of the council elections as well. I think that the Tories did lose quite a bit there. Interestingly, that the Conservatives seem to have lost, and compared to 21, lost in the areas where Brexit happened, where the leave votes in the 2016
Yeah, yeah,
referendum happened. So you can maybe see where that shift might go towards reform to a certain extent, not always, but to a certain extent. But yes, so you've got kind of a Conservative Party collapsing, haven't you? I mean, that's pretty obvious. And
yeah,
you know, good on, well done, because they deserve to collapse, given that they nearly collapsed the economy. But you've got that kind of shift; they're not going right enough, so you've got that kind of move from the Conservatives to Reform.
yeah,
So it could be, I mean, Reform could be the difference between Conservative and Labour in certain seats, because if Reform are taking away seats from Labour,
yeah,
Conservatives,
yeah, 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 yeah.
it may allow the Labour Party to kind of win that seat. In England, it's a different battle up in Scotland, of
Yeah, yeah,
course.
yeah.
Yeah.
So just to move on to like Labour, clearly the
Mm.
result was quite good for Labour, but how
Mhm.
solid do you think that their support is? Especially with like, their results in like Greater Manchester, where you see independent candidates managing to beat Labour, like in their heartlands, and even in the
Yeah.
northeast, where you see independent Jamie Driscoll, even though he didn't win the race, he still racked up 28% of the vote in the northeast of England. Well, Labour is 20 points ahead in the polls. So could that indicate maybe, although they have support now, it's not as solid, come the election if they do win, it might not last as long as they might think.
Yeah, I mean the support for Labour has very only minutely shifted since 2023. So, there was kind of that explosion to Labour, but it's not shifted much since then. According to Sky News, of course, now it's hard to extrapolate, local elections and a general election, but according to
Hmm.
Sky News, if we were to extrapolate this into a general election, Labour would win, but they would not win a majority. There would be
Oh,
32 seats, too low
yeah,
to
yeah.
win that majority. So it's not the kind of big scale victory that often people are expecting of Labour. You mentioned this yourself, but kind of Labour are seeming to be losing in areas, not just where the independents and Greens are standing, but where there is actually pro human rights and pro Palestinian support. So that issue is an element of toxicity for Labour. Now, to be fair, it's in relatively safe seats for Labour,
Hmm.
but it shows that there is a protest against Labour, and that shift towards independent or Greens, because of their position in the war. Sorry, in the genocide against the Palestinian people. So that's quite interesting in itself. I never quite believed the hype for Labour. Labour is that kind of almost default vote. It's just because people want the Tories out,
Yeah.
you know. So there's that element of there's not really a positive case for Labour. It's just that people are sick of the Tories. Now, absolutely get that, but that becomes quite precarious as people begin to shift and make decisions. And Palestine's obviously not their positioning against Palestine is not helping in that respect either.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. So just lastly, like, what do you think or rather, like, on the Tories, like, do you think these results will end up, like, maybe helping Rishi Sunak? Just because there were rumors that if he had lost the Tees Valley, just for him personally, because there are rumors,
Mm.
or reports that if he lost the Tees Valley mayoral election, then there could have been an attempt to oust him by Tory MPs. So do you think these results, even though terrible for the Conservatives, might mean that he might stay in power?
Hard to say, isn't it? Hard to say. If he is, he's going to cling on by the skin of his teeth. I don't think that I don't think this result will stop the plotting to oust him. But the Conservatives are quite hard line in terms of, if they think that Rishi Sunak is going to be an absolute liability, they will get rid as soon as possible. Normally I would say you don't want to get rid of a leader so close to an election, but the SNP's just had that at that point in time as well. But yeah, we'll see what happens. I think that it might let him hold on for the moment. But the talk of replacing him has been going, and it doesn't seem to be going away.
No, yeah. So just, I guess, like, sort of, I don't know, attaching this election to like Scotland, since it's not in Scotland. What effect what effect do you think it could have? Do you think it could result in a general election being closer, or like being in summer? Do you think this result will have any impact on when the general election is, or when the Tories call a general election? And just as well as that, like, what do you think John Swinney now becoming the SNP leader, what effect do you think that could have on a general election for Scotland if it does happen earlier?
That's two very meaty questions there,
Yeah, it is.
actually,
We don't have that
isn't
much
it?
time
Yeah.
left.
I'm not quite sure whether it'll make a difference. I mean, it'll make, in terms of the timing, it might make a difference based on what you were saying. You know, if there is a shift to get rid of Rishi Sunak, then that'll probably delay it slightly because the new leader would have to bed in. But if they're kind of deciding to stick with Rishi Sunak, they'll just kind of go with plan. They've got till January next year, so it's we're moving into territory where it's getting very, very close. I think is it 8 weeks? I think it is before the election, and you need to call it. So it's hard to say for that. In terms of John Swinney, a poll that came out just over, that was done over the last week. There was increased support for the Greens, but the SNP seemed to hold relatively well in terms of the general election. They were still neck and neck with
Yeah.
Labour. So in that respect, we don't know. That was a moment of deep crisis for us. So the fact that we held that, it is only one poll, but the fact that we held that is maybe quite positive. It's hard to say what John Swinney will do. I think there's an element of calm, and kind of certainly within the party there's an element of calm that we wanted and we felt we needed, and hence like John Swinney's name coming quite quickly into the fore, because I think the party felt that we needed kind of someone to kind of take leadership. And just, you might not know, but historically John Swinney came to the party in 2000 as leader, and he was 4 years as leader, and it was a time of turmoil as well. So
Okay.
he manages turmoil. He managed to modernise the party as well during that time. I'm hopeful that John Swinney and a kind of new reset perhaps will kind of allow us to claw back that 5%. We've lost about 5% of the vote since Nicola left, and we've never quite managed to regain that for lots of different reasons. I'm not putting that down to Humza as leader. If anything, I think he's gained support, especially in his position of Palestine and his relationship with trade unions and so forth as well. So there was a lot of kind of positive stuff there that Humza, I think, brought people to the party and to the movement. But I think that John's maybe stability might just allow us to kind of just push forward. He's also very good. He's very experienced, and he's very good at analysing and debating against other leaders. So I'll look forward to seeing him in the televised debates, actually.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah. So, sorry. So on to our next main story of the night: college strikes in Scotland. Scottish college lecturers and education staff went out on strike today, calling for a better pay deal and rejecting a college pay offer that would amount to a real terms pay cut for most college employees. This marks the last day of 3 weeks of rolling strikes organised by the EIS Fila trade union, which represents college lecturers and educational staff. This morning, I went to a picket outside the City of Glasgow College and spoke to some of the striking workers.
My name's Laura Hans. I'm a lecturer at City of Glasgow College, and I'm also the EIS Fila branch secretary.
So your union's been on strike now for 3 weeks. What is it hoping, or what have they been hoping to achieve for the 3 weeks of rolling strikes? And have you made any progress with the employers?
Yeah, so we've been striking now really on and off for about 8 years. Every single year we have to struggle to get a fair pay award. Lecturers currently haven't had a pay rise since August 2021, so the latest sort of wave of rolling strikes reflect that. So we're out here today at the college, picketing at City of Glasgow College. We're also undertaking action short of strike that involves a resultant boycott and working to the letter of our contracts. So college lecturers have not had a pay rise since August 2021, and the current offer from college employers of £5,000 really equates to, and that's over 3 years, would equate to a real term pay cut for college lecturers. Bear in mind that over the same period of time from 2021, other public sector workers in the NHS and teachers, for example, have been given much higher pay uplifts. So why not college lecturers? Because we're also part of the public sector, and colleges like this one, City of Glasgow College, serve an important function in tackling poverty and inequality through serving some of the most disadvantaged and working class communities in Glasgow.
So have you made any progress so far with these 3 weeks of rolling strikes?
Yeah, so at the moment there's kind of stalemate between the union and between the college employers. So we're really looking for the Scottish Government to step up and step in. Colleges are part of the public sector. College lecturers should be given a fair pay award, so if there's going to be any movement towards resolving the dispute nationally, the Scottish Government really have to step up now and give the college sector more money. The college sector is chronically underfunded as compared to other social institutions.
Yeah, so that sort of brings me to the next question. Do you think, are you expecting the money to come from the college themselves, or are you more expecting the Scottish Government to pay more in order for the college to have, the adequate funds in order to, give you the pay offer that you're trying to negotiate?
So like I say, the Scottish Government really has to put the funding in. So over the past 2 years, colleges have been given a flat cash funding that really for colleges equates to a funding cut. Because colleges like City of Glasgow College then are given free rein to have to balance the books in any way they see fit. In places like this, the largest college in Scotland, what you find is they immediately look to cut courses, to cut the number of student cohorts that we have, to cut learning support, and also to make staff redundant. So here at City of Glasgow College, we're now going through yet another phase of redundancies. Having gone through compulsory redundancies last year, we're once again moving to make staff redundant. College management do claim that it's because of funding cuts. Our concern as the union branch at City of Glasgow College is how the money is being spent coming into this college as well.
I'm talking to Caro, who's a lecturer at City of Glasgow College. So what's the impact of the strike been like for you specifically as a worker? In terms of, your ability to lecture and your ability to teach?
It's all the hours you're missing, student hours, the hours that the students aren't getting to speak to their lecturer, to be in contact with staff, that's it. It's the contact time that the students are missing. The changes that have happened in here over this last year have really impacted the way we teach as well. We would normally be teaching the same class maybe a couple of times and you would get to know the students, better student experience, whereas now, because of the way that the cuts have happened, we've got less time with the students for each lesson, and we also only get to see the students maybe once a week.
So just picking up on what was mentioned this morning, do you think that the Scottish Government needs to increase funding for colleges?
I think it is chronically underfunded. I think that has become obvious. I think that the problem we have is that it's having a fixed budget. It means making kind of some decisions that some cuts have to be made. That's not in any way an excuse. It just means that we cannot borrow, we cannot invest it, as much as perhaps we would want to in those institutions. But as kind of the lecturer pointed out, it's that the college sector do work in terms of inequality and trying to reduce the the equality gap through education. So these institutions are important, are very much important. So there is problems there. I did pick up up that she said it wasn't just the kind of the cuts, it was how, the local colleges were using that funding as well. So there seems to be a kind of two-way issue there.
Yeah.
One of the things about John Swinney, of course, is you may remember or you may know that he was Education Secretary at one point and actually did gain quite a lot of respect from the EIS union in teaching. So it's maybe an opportunity for John Swinney to kind of, use that relationship again to maybe kind of try and resolve some of these issues. They deserve a pay rise the same as any other public sector pay rise. It seems incredibly unfair that their pay rise seems lower than other public sector workers. The problem we have, of course, with inflation massively being so high is that even kind of what would be considered half decent pay cuts are still considered kind of pay rises. It would still be considered a pay cut because it's still below the rate of inflation. But it is difficult. But we all know the cost of living is phenomenally high now. The cost of food, the cost of energy, everything has just spiraled, and it becomes increasingly more difficult. So yeah, I mean there are real issues, I think, there in the college sector, and investing in your staff is probably one of the first things you want to do.
Yeah. Do you think that's been a bit of a failure of the government in the last, term? Because I was being told that, the lecturers hadn't been given a raise in like 3 years at this point.
Yeah, I am. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, they've been obviously offered that deal. I think my understanding was that deal was meant to kick in 2022. So I'm kind of a bit confused as to why that wasn't the case. I think the 2022 and then that 3-year deal of 5,000. So I'm not sure how that wasn't the case. So apologies for that. I don't know.
Well, I think
Do you know if it's a fail? Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think in 2022 was when the deal came into action for 2021,
fair enough.
2022.
Yeah, that
But I
makes
think it was
sense.
given in 2021, so it was sort of like maybe 2.5 years, without a pay rise.
Yes, yeah, see what you mean actually. Sorry, I kind of got that a bit confused. I don't want to say a failure of the government because I think that we're all up against it in terms of the money that we don't get and the cuts that have been made massively in terms of kind of the money we get from the UK government. And we're limited to kind of raise money and so forth as well. There's that kind of element of kind of what needs to be prioritised, and everything has priorities, if that makes sense. I think that if we were in an ideal world, education would be invested phenomenally better. I wouldn't like to be making those finance decisions, put it that way. I see it from both sides. I see it from, being in a council and trying to kind of like work through the budget, and the sleepless nights I had kind of like thinking about the budget and the phenomenally difficult decisions that were made. But, I see it from a worker perspective, is that, these people have families to feed. People go into education to try and better their opportunities. So I don't know, but there needs to be some thinking about how we manage this and how we go forward with it and how we invest better into that system.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, like you sort of mentioned my second question, but do you think the government should be providing more oversight, like over the fund it gives the colleges? Because just for some context, in the city of Glasgow College where I was, like I think the principal gets, over £100,000 a year. I think I read a report that they spent £250,000 during COP26 for events which mostly cater towards, politicians, and they're quite wealthy, aides and whatnot. So do you think, especially since it's, taxpayer money, do you think there should be some oversight towards, where the college spend it?
Oh, you mean in terms of, kind of
Terms of
like,
government,
setting out money and saying it can only be spent on X, Y, and Z? Yes, sorry, yes. No,
Yeah.
well, actually, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how the college sector would work in that respect, but it does seem to me to be kind of, how does somebody get £100,000 when their staff are not even getting a wage rise type of situation? So
Yeah.
if we're looking towards a fair work policy, then maybe we should be thinking about that. There's a fine, again, there is a line, because you don't want a political institution dictating the educational process in the college, but at the same time, maybe there could be something where certain money has to be earmarked towards staff investment in that respect. So you could kind of maybe tie that fund in a little bit better.
No, that's definitely a good point. Yeah, like I can definitely see the issues of becoming too political, but yeah, at the same time, like at the moment, look where the money's going. So to move on to our next story, Scottish Labour MSPs believe UK bosses ordered WASPy vote abstention. The National is alleging that Scottish Labour MSPs were ordered by the UK Labour Party in London to abstain on a motion calling for compensation for WASPy women. Anit Sarwar, MSP, abstained on the SNP motion put before the Scottish Parliament on Wednesday, which called on the UK government to pay compensation in full to WASPy women without delay. The National say they have spoken with Scottish Labour insiders who believe Sarwar's party was ordered by the UK Labour Party not to vote with the SNP. It is normal for Labour MPs at Westminster to adhere to the Bain principle and abstain or vote against any SNP motions or votes. However, the Holyrood Parliament is more cohesive on matters which parties agree on, and it would have been expected that Labour MSPs would have voted for a motion which they claim to support. Scottish Labour have insisted that they back compensation for WASPy women, but it would seem that the UK party could have been concerned about the appearance of Scottish Labour having voted for the UK government to pay compensation, which an incoming Labour government might not be willing to support. So, what do you think this says about like the UK Labour Party in general and their priorities?
God, we've only got 20 minutes. So, I mean, this is my frustration, and I was kind of brought up in a Labour background. I did my PhD on the Labour movement and the early days of Labour and the left in the 1920s specifically as well. The problem that Labour seems to have, and I this is what I do not get. This is what I genuinely do not get. So we were just saying that earlier on that people are voting Labour just because they just don't want the Tories, right? So people are just saying that I'm going to vote anybody bar the Tories. The Tories are out. I'm going to vote anybody bar the Tories. So, but instead of Labour using this as an opportunity to kind of say, right, okay, here are our core priorities. This is our anti-poverty priority. This is our house building programme. This is this. All these kind of social democratic strategies that Labour once were actually famous for. They don't seem to be doing this. They seem to be kind of doing, oh, well, I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to do that, and carcane, everybody, we're just not going to we might not have the money to do anything. So it just seems utterly bizarre to me that they're not even thinking about how they can start tackling these issues. The WASPy women, it's a good case in point. I mean, it's clearly it's an egregious thing that happened to these women, and they've been fighting for years. And it's one of those things that everybody agrees pretty much that they should be entitled to compensation given what happened. It wasn't just the kind of wasn't just the pension age; it was the fact that women didn't even get told. But there is that kind of element. I think the National kind of broke that story a few weeks ago, didn't that the UK Labour are worried that it might actually put a commitment on them. The problem with Scottish Labour is that they do kind of sit in this anti-SNP discourse, and it's difficult for them to crawl their way out of that sometimes. And, so this is, I think, is maybe a good case in point. Is like, yes, they would want the WASPy women to get compensation, but it's almost like, but the SNP done it, therefore we're not going to we're not going to support it. And I do think there's an element of that from UK Labour as well, that kind of sense of collegiality that you mentioned in the Scottish Parliament doesn't really work in Westminster. It doesn't happen quite as much. And we have a general election coming up when Labour are trying to grab the SNP seats and trying to win the seats of SNP within Scotland. So there's a lot of kind of political manoeuvring there. But quite frankly, it just makes Scottish Labour look spineless. And shame on them for abstaining from that. It just made them look absolutely weak. God knows, I have a few friends that are WASPy women, but God knows what they're thinking.
Yeah. So moving on to our next story, High Court rules UK government climate action plan is unlawful. The High Court has ruled that the UK government's climate action plan is unlawful, and there is not enough evidence that there are sufficient policies in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The environmental charity Friends of the Earth and Client Earth took joint legal action with the Good Law Project against the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero over its decision to approve the Carbon Budget Delivery Plan, CBDP, in March 2023. In a ruling today, Mr. Justice Sheldon upheld four of the five grounds of the group's legal challenge, stating that the decision by the former Energy Secretary and Net Zero Secretary Grant Shapps was simply not justified by the evidence. He said, quote, "If, as I have found, the Secretary of State did make his decision on the assumption that each of the proposals and policies would be delivered in full, then the Secretary of State's decision was taken on the basis of a mistaken understanding of the true factual position," end quote. The judge agreed with Client Earth and Friends of the Earth that the Secretary of State was given, quote, "incomplete information about the likelihood that proposed policies would achieve their intended emissions cuts. This breached Section 13 of the Climate Change Act, which requires the Secretary of State to adopt plans and proposals that they consider will enable upcoming carbon budgets to be delivered." Sheldon also agreed with the environmental groups that the central assumption that the department's policies would achieve 100% of their intended emission cuts was wrong. The judge said the Secretary of State had acted irrationally and on the basis of an incorrect understanding of the facts. The UK government Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, will now be expected to draw up a revised plan within 12 months. The UK must ensure that this must ensure that the UK achieves its legally binding carbon budget and its pledge to cut emissions by more than 2/3 by 2030, neither of which the government is on track to meet. So, Siobhan, do you think the government is serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions in general? And just, I guess, as a secondary question, actually, no, I'll just keep that as my only question because we're running out of time.
Okay. Curious to see what the second one was. No, I don't think they're serious at all. I mean, the Climate Change Committee's assessment last year was that they've only really got credible plans for less than 20% of the emissions cuts needed. So it looked to me, and the court, I think, has kind of agreed, or they probably wouldn't have put it in those words, that it was more of a PR exercise rather than a strategy. And that seems to be kind of very much kind of conservative model of behaviour. Let's just deal with issues with a good bit of PR, and then we'll just pretend that nothing, just pretend that we're doing this. I don't think that. I honestly do not. I mean, I think that just shows exactly that they're not. The fact that they couldn't even write a paper to build a decent strategy on how to do this shows that they have neither the will, the knowledge, or the understanding in order to kind of get that sorted. It's why the Tories are kind of losing absolute kind of power across the UK, because people just know that this is exactly an utterly Tory thing to do. It's pretend we're doing it and do nothing.
Yeah. So, to move on to the next story, UK government to allow oil and gas exploration at offshore wind sites. The UK government has announced today that it intends to allow fossil fuel companies to explore for oil and gas under offshore wind power sites for the first time, in a move which campaigners said is further proof that UK ministers are abandoning the climate agenda. The North Sea Transportation Authority, NSTA, which regulates North Sea oil and gas production, has offered a further 31 licenses in the latest phase of the 33rd oil and gas licensing round to allow companies to look for hydrocarbons on sites embarked for future offshore wind farms. The move has brought the move has brought renewed criticism of Rishi Sunak from environmentalists, including from the Prime Minister's own former net zero czar, who worry that any future oil and gas production could hamper clean energy generation. A spokesperson for the NSTA said, quote, "The NSTA have worked closely with other regulators to consider matters of co-location with offshore wind and other users. Sources say that the oil exploration itself will not involve any drilling, with companies largely using data to decide whether sites have the potential to be profitable for extraction. Supporters of the scheme add that if any of the sites under wind farms prove suitable for production, oil and gas platforms will be able to use power from their wind turbines to lower their emissions. They will also have to strike an agreement with the wind farm operators before they can begin drilling. Experts say, however, that the emissions from burning any oil and gas produced will far outweigh whatever is saved in the drilling and extraction processes. They add that today's announcement will undermine investor confidence in the UK's green energy sector as a whole. So, Siobhan, another story on the Tories sort of failing to meet their targets. I've got my question is a bit more broad. Does this show that the government was never really serious about its net zero targets in the first place? And do you think that the risk of the British government and other governments creating sort of cynicism around addressing climate change by setting all these really ambitious targets with no actual plan or policy to enact them?
Yeah. I think that and this is the kind of history of the Conservative Party, is that it's not just that they're pro-business, it's that it is profit above all else. And when you are driven by that philosophy, then very little else comes into play. So, in the post-45 UK, for instance, we had that kind of slightly different economy where it needed kind of, it needed business, but it also needed kind of healthy, well looked after workforce. So hence you got things like like free education, the health service, all those kind of things that would allow kind of well-being for the population.
Yeah.
But the Conservative policy has stripped us, and I am getting to that point. The point is that if it derives a profit, then nothing else really matters. And I think that's put crudely, but I think that drives that philosophy, and that you can see that within their green policies as well. You just need to look at that. This is about profit. This is about profit. You said that itself. They're not drilling. They're just checking to see whether it's profitable or not. They will never stop. And that's the problem. The Conservatives, I don't think, will ever stop. And it's this madness of saying, but it's okay because we're going to use the wind turbines to power the process of trying to dig the oil. It's utter madness. And I'm going to quote Doug Parr, who's the policy director for Greenpeace. He said, "It's hard to think of worse use of clean electricity from wind farms than powering the dirty industry that's driving the climate crisis. It's like using a nicotine patch to roll a cigarette." And it's that kind of madness that they're thinking about, as if somehow that's okay because they're using a wind turbine somewhere along the line. There is no understanding of the urgency of climate. All they seem to understand is profit. And you saw that through COVID as well. While we were using a public health test and trace system, worked through the kind of working through the public health system, they privatised that because the only thing they understood how to do was to look at it from a privatised profit-making process. And that's when it becomes very dangerous. That's why the Conservatives are kind of like running out of favour here, because that philosophy has reached its course and people are sick of it, actually. And then you'll look at the kind of the climate. It's very dangerous to the climate, and it's another reason why the Tories need out of power.
So on to our next story, UN experts warning over right-wing laws that could whitewash Franco era in Spain. New laws proposed by right-wing and far-right regional coalition governments to, quote, whitewash the Franco dictatorship could contravene international human rights standards. UN experts on truth, justice, forced disappearances and killings have warned Spain. 2 years ago, Spain's socialist-led government introduced a democratic memory law designed to bring, quote, justice, reparation and dignity to the victims of the civil war and subsequent dictatorship. The law, which built on previous socialist legislation, contains dozens of measures intended to help, quote, settle Spanish democracy's debt to its past. Among them were the creation of a census and a national DNA bank to help locate and identify the remains of the tens of thousands of people who still lie in unmarked graves, a ban on groups that glorify the Franco regime, and a redefinition of the Valley of the Fallen, the giant basilisk and memorial where Franco lay for 44 years until his exhumation in 2019. The Conservative People's Party, PP, and the far-right Vox Party, which both oppose the law, have been attempting to replace it with, quote, harmony laws in 3 regions where they govern in coalition: Aragon, Castilla and Valencia. Critics of the harmony laws, including the national government and historic memory associations, have decried them as a blatant attempt to play down, justify, or eradicate the horrors of the Franco era in Spain. In a letter sent to the Spanish government at the end of April, 3 UN experts said the information they had received about the proposed laws, quote, could affect the Spanish state's obligation when it comes to human rights, especially its obligations to guarantee the preservation of historical memory on serious human rights violations. The letter, signed by Fabian Slavioli, the Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice and reparation, Aude Blade, the chair of the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances, and the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions added, quote, we would urge the Spanish government to take all the necessary measures to guarantee the strict respect for international standards governing the preservation of historical memory on serious human rights violations. So, Siobhan, why do you think so many conservative parties in Spain have an issue with this law and many refuse to fully condemn the Franco era?
Sorry, do you mean the democratic memory law? I'm assuming that you mean that rather than the harmony law that the right's bringing in. Yes. It's that link between past and present, isn't it? And if we begin to understand the horrors of our past, and if we look at the UK, we've got their own horrors. If we look at Germany, they've got their own. Spain have got their own as well. We all have that, but it's about that relationship with the past and the understanding of what happened there, and it helps us. It helps us reflect for the present, and it helps us understand the present and how we would go forward, how we would avoid those traps that we fell into in the past as well. I think to a certain extent, these right-wing conservative parties, they're trying to gaslight our past, if that makes sense. They're trying to gaslight the Spanish past and almost pretend that it didn't happen or downplay the seriousness of it happening. I think about this a lot because, the US and the UK in particular, we have this very, very peculiar relationship to our past that we deny that it happened. We deny our imperial past. We deny our colonial past. Germany's quite different. They have this very, very kind of very healthy questioning relationship to their past. So, kids are taught about the war and Germany's role in the war. And in Bavaria, kids need to go to, the camps in order to see for themselves those things that happened. So there's an attempt to build reparation there for the past and understand the relationship to the past and the horrors of that. When conservatives or right-wing organisations start to tell us that past wasn't as bad as what it was, or if you think of the Holocaust deniers, it didn't happen at all, we move into territory where we begin to actually make it okay for it beginning to happen now. And that's where the problem lies. It's not just a history thing, although history is important because we need to understand our history, the faults of our history as well as the positives as well. But we need to understand where we've gone wrong in our history and the horrors that we have put upon people in order to kind of grow and evolve and move forward with a better society as we move forward. This is part of a political campaign to pretend that it's not happened, and it's not disconnected to the fact that these are right wing, because these are the type of actions, once you start dehumanizing people, then you begin to think, well, okay, it's fine, we can move down that path of dehumanization, and we know where dehumanization goes. So there's that cyclical effect, I think, that, trying to kind of gaslight people and pretend that history didn't happen means that there's a move in the present to try and relive those actions. And that's what worries me the most, is we never learn from that history. We continue to repeat those paths. And I think that the right are doing it deliberately. We see it across the board. You look at Donald Trump as well, that kind of extreme shift to the right and the dehumanization that is occurring there. So there's deep links with the history, and to start to push on that history and try and wipe that out, it's deeply concerning, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Germany, because I think a lot of people think of Germany, the country which has sort of like came to terms with this like fascist past. But I think, yeah, a lot of people don't think that Italy and Spain, for example, they're also fascist in the not so distant past, and they haven't. A lot of people in those countries are still, somewhat sympathetic, and even on the center right, like People's Party, like we're talking about in Spain, it's hardly like a far right party, but even it's quite out there.
I was watching Yanis Varoufakis, the ex
Yeah.
Greek finance minister, and he was saying that, in many places in Europe, we have that past. We were all, lots of countries were involved in that to a greater or lesser degree. It's just that, there's one country that's not, and I'm not going to say scapegoated, because Germany was that kind of historical factor, but, it's like you say, we tend to ignore the other elements of it. I think that sometimes as well, and I think this is for the UK and perhaps the US especially, as we tumble from crisis to crisis at the moment, it is in part because we've never come to terms with our colonial past and the horrors that we did, and we'll never kind of get on a right footing unless we do come to terms with those, because we can't go forward as a society if we pretend those horrors didn't happen.
So for our last story of the night, the Scottish Government extends carer support payments to 10 new council areas. Thousands more unpaid carers in Scotland will be eligible for a new benefit if regulations laid this week in Scottish Parliament are approved. Carer support payment is the replacement for carers allowance in Scotland. It was first launched in November 2023 in 3 pilot areas: Perth and Kinross, Dundee City, and the Western Isles. It will be available in 10 new local authority areas this summer as part of the next phase of the rollout, starting with North and South Lancashire and Angus on the 24th of June. From August, it will extend to Fife, Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire, Moray, and North East and South Ayrshire, and be available in the rest of Scotland in November. Eligible carers who live in areas where carer support payment is not yet available are still being urged to apply for carers allowance to make sure they don't miss out on the support. Since it launched, carer support payment, unlike carers allowance, is also available to carers aged 16 to 19 in full-time advanced education, and carers aged over 20 in full-time education at any level. These regulations will see eligibility further extended to some 16 to 19-year-old carers in full-time non-advanced education, such as school, from 24th of June. Social Justice Secretary Shirley Ann Somerville said, "I am delighted we are ready to roll out the next phase of carer support payment, allowing thousands more unpaid carers to get the benefit. This is particularly important for those who aren't eligible for carers allowance, but are eligible for carer support payment, including many full-time students. Having spoken to carers in the pilot areas, I know carer support payment is not only providing financial support to students who couldn't get it before, but it's allowing carers to study full-time who would never have thought this would be possible before. Quote, I urge anyone who lives in an area where carer support payment is available to apply for it as soon as possible. So Siobhan, what impact do you think this legislation could have, like, on carers?
I mean, my other role is working at a university in Dundee, and I'm just thinking of some of my students that would, the younger students that would benefit from that carers allowance. I think that there is a, bringing it into younger people, I think is a really, because there's not much difference in terms of the money and stuff that you get, that
Yeah.
transition. There's no difference, but it's the extension to the younger people, and there's a cultural shift there, which I think is really positive, and it's a recognition that young people are carers. We think of carers, and the image tends to be, older, and once you're kind of like, hitting a certain age and stuff like that. But there's lots of kind of young carers out there, and there's that element of recognition there. But actually, importantly as well, it gives that financial assistance. The shift into the school is a really interesting one, and a really kind of positive shift as well, because what it does is it validates the kids, it validates them as carers, but also actually will help them kind of have that kind of bit more financial stability while they're still in their education, and hopefully help them remain within education where perhaps they might not have as well. It's not, I think it's 81.50 or something like that. So it's money not to be scoffed at, if that makes sense. So I think that that's a really, really positive thing. And I think that what it does is it's certainly something that the Scottish Government have been keen to do across the board. And I remember kind of Shona Robison, when she was kind of social justice, she was talking about this as well. It's trying to just offer credibility and thanks, and a recognition, as Shirley Ann Somerville said today, a recognition that they are a core part of our economy as well. It's, we're not just helping those individuals that kind of end up caring for parents or whoever, and members of the family. It's a recognition that they are needed within our society, and that the society is built upon that, what has traditionally been unpaid care. So there is a kind of shift in our thinking there, which I think is really positive.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, that's all I've got time for this evening, but before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view, however, if you can afford just £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our focus must now move to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. So, thank you again to our guest, Siobhan. Thanks. Goodbye, and thanks for watching.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.